The exposure triangle. All right, let's get into it. So here's a picture of the camera we'll be using for this tutorial. And when you want to control, have full control that is, over all of your settings, you need to be setting your camera to the manual mode. Now, if you're using a cell phone or something like that, you may not have a full manual control of your camera. However, there are a lot of apps out there that you can get that will allow you to fully control your camera. So you might want to look into that. But when we set to manual mode, we have access to change the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed. What are those things? Well, those are the three things that make up the exposure triangle. Because photogrammetry needs full control of the camera settings, we need to understand how to set the exposure correctly. We gain full control of the camera by setting it to manual mode, which is the M that I showed you in the earlier picture. So we want to get an exposure level of 0. 0 means that you're not overexposed and you're not underexposed. Anything that's in a negative would be underexposure. Anything that's over 0 will be overexposed. Understanding how each factor of the exposure triangle affects the image is paramount for getting accurate, adequate data and reconstructing accurate, clean 3D models. So as we mentioned before, the exposure triangle is made up of the shutter, the aperture, and the ISO. Let's explain what these mean. The shutter is how long the sensor is exposed to light. The aperture is how open the iris in the lens is, and the ISO is the sensitivity the sensor is to light. Let's go ahead and look at what some of these settings look like in the real world. All right, so here's a video of a shutter opening and closing and then being open and closed in slow motion.
In real time.
So as you can see, there's an actual piece that comes down over the sensor, and then there's another one that comes up from the bottom. This is actually a physical shutter. A lot of cameras nowadays also can be doing electronic shutter, but it's probably best to use the physical shutter for photogrammetry. Here's an example of the aperture opening and closing. So you can see there's an iris there, and as the aperture opens, it's going to let a lot more light hit the sensor. But this actually affects things in a way that usually for photogrammetry you don't want. So we're usually going to have an aperture that's closed down more of a pinhole. So the shutter opens, exposing the camera to the photons, measured in fractions of a second. So you might see 1/8 or 1/200 or 1/2000 of a second. The longer the shutter is open, the more chance of blurry photos from the camera or a subject moving. Now in photogrammetry, of course, the subject should not be moving. So the only thing we'd have to worry about is if we're hand holding, getting some kind of shape. So the photogrammetry, the shutter only needs to be fast if we are hand holding. On a tripod, the shutter can be left open for greater periods of time so that the ISO and aperture can be set optimally. Hand-holding shutter speed depends on the steadiness of your hands. 1/200th of a second is a good speed to try to stay at or above for hand-holding. Now there's also something called IBIS, and IBIS stands for in-body image stabilization. IBIS may allow the shutter to be open longer for hand-holding in some cameras. IBIS should be left off if the camera is on a tripod. In this case, with the Sony, this does have IBIS, although the IBIS is not the best out there, so you still have to be careful not to have your shutter speed too slow. A good rule of thumb is to check a few pictures and make sure that you're not seeing blurry images that might be coming from camera shake. Okay, so let's talk about ISO. ISO is like boosting the signal coming out of the camera sensor. Turning the ISO up, though, introduces noise in the image. So this can be a big problem for photogrammetry. Too much noise will result in noisy, undesirable photogrammetry results because you won't get a nice, clean model if you have a very noisy image. We'll look at examples of this really soon. So you only want to turn the ISO up if you're hand holding, And that's just so that you can get the shutter speed at the speed that you need. On a tripod, keep the ISO as low as possible. That's going to get you your best results. All right, aperture is the thing that we probably have to go into the most depth with all of the explanation here. And the aperture relates to the diameter of the iris in the lens. We saw an example of that just earlier. The aperture is measured in f-stops. So an f-stop equals how much light you allow to hit the sensor via the aperture opening. So f16 is actually a small opening, while an f14 is a larger opening. It sort of seems like it should be the other way around, but it's actually a fraction, so it works differently. So what we're trying to control with the aperture is less about the light and more about the depth of field. The aperture is directly related to the depth of field. So the depth of field is how much is in focus in the image. The opening of the aperture will determine the depth of field. So for photogrammetry, we want to make sure the depth of field is great enough that the entire subject is in focus. Depth of field of f16 is greater than of f4. The smaller the opening is, the more that is in focus. So basically like a pinhole type of opening will be more in focus. The closer your camera is to the subject makes also a smaller depth of field. So if you're trying to do macro photogrammetry, it's tricky because you get very, very close to the subject many times, and then you get a really, really shallow depth of field, which is why you might want to use something like focus stacking, which is a more advanced thing that we can talk about later. Two ways of increasing the depth of field is to stop down the aperture or move further from the subject. That's basically all you can do to get more depth of field. Now, another trick might be that you don't try to get the entire subject in the picture, and so you're getting only sections that you can get the whole depth of field in, so you don't have to get too far away from your subject. Because if you want to maximize how much detail you're getting in your images, and the further you get away from your image, of course, the less details that you're going to see. All right, so with the aperture and the depth of field, we also should talk about diffraction. So diffraction is a phenomenon that happens where interference or bending of light waves around the corners of the apertures occur. So basically, the tighter the aperture is closed, the more diffraction that you get. So we have to get this balance where we want it as close as we can get it so we get more depth of field, but we don't want it so close that we're causing the light to bend, basically. Stopping down the aperture too much, of course, causes the diffraction. Basically, it will make blurry images and diminish details. It's probably less of a problem than having the aperture too wide open and getting too little depth of field. So if I had a choice and I had to get a little bit of diffraction, I'd rather have a little diffraction than have a super shallow depth of field, because you'll have more problems with that. For full frame sensors, f16 and below is best to avoid diffraction, but it can change from lens to lens. This is not something that is the same for every single lens. So testing the optimal f-stop might be important. That's not something I would worry about right now, but I would just go with like general rules at this point. But if you start going ahead and buying different lenses for photogrammetry, you may want to go ahead and check those before you put your money into it and make sure you know how much depth of field you can get. The diffraction f-stop number is usually lower for APS-C and micro four thirds cameras. So on my micro four thirds cameras, I'm usually at about f4 or 5 to get the best sharpness. And on those cameras, though, you actually because it's a crop factor, and I don't want to get into explaining the entire crop factor, but if it's an f5, it's actually an f10 depth of field. So that's just how it works. So you just have to crunch the numbers a little bit different for that. But with a small, because micro four thirds is a smaller sensor, the lenses are smaller, and so you get closer to diffraction faster. So if you go ahead and you're at like f16 on a micro four thirds, that's actually smaller than f16 on a full frame. So that's a good thing to understand if you're going to go ahead and get an APS-C or a micro four thirds camera, which, by the way, I do use both of those for photogrammetry and they work great. You just have to understand that the numbers work a little bit differently. All right, so let's look at this exposure triangle here, this little graphic. And basically, we have our shutter, we have our ISO, and we have our aperture. So, of course, we know that these fractions, 1/8 of a second, is going to be a lot longer than 1/1000th of a second. If our subject's moving or our hand's moving, then 1/8 of a second, if we're hand holding, you're probably going to get blur in your picture unless you're really, really steady hand. Uh, so you're probably going to want to be somewhere in the, above this 1/25th for hand holding. What happens though is that, of course, it starts letting less light in. So once you start letting less light in, you have two choices to get more light. So you can see this has this brighter thing here. So you can actually boost the ISO, which will give you more light, or you can go ahead and open the aperture up more, which will let in more light. Now, boosting the ISO, if I had a choice of what I would do for the shutter, I would probably boost the ISO before I mess with my aperture, because the fact is that if I take my aperture down to f4 and I'm not getting the whole subject in focus, I'm going to get blurry results no matter what. So I'm going to try to keep my aperture somewhere around f8 to f16 and then work with my ISO. However, we have another problem, and that is if you look at this ISO graphic down here, you get the more noise, right? So when you get too much noise, you don't even get good detail. So you have a problem there. So for full frame, staying under ISO 3200 is probably a good idea. Depends on the camera, but I would say going up to 3200 is risking getting really noisy results. If you're somewhere between 100 and 1600 ISO, you're probably pretty good. Now, as far as aperture goes, I'm going to show you how to determine how much depth of field you need, and then you'll be able to figure that out and just set your aperture at whatever you need. And so you'll work with the shutter and the ISO to get the rest of the exposure correct. Now, if you're on a tripod, you would want to set your aperture as high as you can without diffraction and set the ISO as low as you can, and then the shutter speed can be whatever you want because the camera's not moving and the subject's not moving. So you don't have to worry about anything at that point. So that's basically how you're going to work this exposure triangle. Now I'm going to go ahead and just show you some examples here. Right here is an image that I took at f1.4. So the lens is a Sigma 35 millimeter f1.4 to f16 lens, and you can see at f1.4 with my focus on this chart right here that we get very, very, very soft results very, very fast. So it's completely blurred out at this point closer to the camera, and you couldn't use this at all. In fact, even if you got close to this little block here, this is actually pretty much blurred out too, so that's not going to work too well. This block is 3.5 centimeters, so just 3.5 centimeters off of this focal plane, you're not getting good results. You're going to have a problem. You can really see it here if you look at this ruler over here, where this thing just falls off almost immediately. Okay, so looking at that, let's look at something else. Let's go ahead and we'll do this side. This is f16 on this side, so it's the same camera position, but this one was taken at f16, and you can see the depth of field is completely different. And you can even see, for instance, with this block, how different that is. So that gives you a good example of why you can't use a really wide open aperture in these instances, because you get problems like this, and you can't really do photogrammetry with that. Okay, so with the full picture in focus, I have the near limit of sharpness that is good is this line right here. And I'm going to show you how I figured that out, because this is an important thing to want to know. There's technical ways to do it, and then there's more hands-on ways to do it, which is you can go ahead and just test by taking a few pictures at different f-stops and seeing if you're getting the whole object in there. But if not, or if you have a tape measure, you can figure out a technical way that you know exactly where your near limit is and your far limit of depth of field is. Let's go ahead and just look at the numbers here. So we'll bring this one back up. Okay, so on the left side, we have that original f1.4, and on the right side, we have the aperture of f16. Now, the shutter, of course, is going to go faster with the f4 because to get a proper exposure, we're not going to let too much light in, otherwise this whole picture would be blown out. So we have to speed the shutter up. I kept the ISO as low as I could because it was on a tripod, so that's exactly what you would want, is the lowest ISO. So our shutter went up to 1/320th of a second, and that's the aperture of f1.4. Our focal plane is 84.5 centimeters. So that was from the camera's sensor plane to the actual chart on the wall was 84.5 centimeters. Now, the near depth of field of that is only 82.19. So let me move this up a little bit so we can see it here. So we have 82.19, and the far limit is 86.94. So from this center object here, the whole depth of field is basically only 4.74 centimeters, going in front and in back, and basically halving that. It's not exactly half. You actually usually get a little bit more past the object, but it's pretty close to almost in the middle. Let's hide this right there. So we can see on the other side where we have the aperture at f16, I have to drop the shutter to 1/3 of a second. So if I was hand holding, I would probably have a big problem with that. If I needed to hand hold it and need to get this number up higher, then I would start raising the ISO, maybe to ISO 800 or something like that. Now, with the f16 aperture, you can see that I get a near depth of field of 64.14 centimeters and a far depth of field of 123.79 centimeters, which gives me a total depth of field of 59.65 centimeters, which is way different than 4 centimeters or almost 5 centimeters. So that's a big deal when you're doing photogrammetry. You want to make sure that you can maximize this to get your whole object. Now, if you have an object that's smaller and you can do it at f8, that's perfectly fine. In fact, sometimes f8 is actually might be a little bit sharper for your lens, because lenses typically might have almost every lens has a sweet spot where it's at its sharpest. And a lot of times for full frame, that is f8 is where it's at its sharpest, but that does affect how much depth of field you have. So this is great, this number here. So how did I figure out that number? Okay, so in my web browser, I just did a search for depth of field calculator photography, and the first thing that came up was this depth of field calculator by PhotoPills. So I went ahead and opened that, and this is great because we have these different entries that we can put in here that will help us calculate this. So the camera is an A7R3, but they have an A7R2 here, which is fine. It's the same sensor. They didn't change sensors between the two cameras. And I know the focal length is 35 millimeters, and I have the aperture at f16. And then I measure the subject distance from my camera's focal plane to the wall. And so I have that. And then it just calculates it for me. And so I can see the depth of field near limit is 64.14. The far limit is 123.79. And so we're getting a depth of field of 59.65. So the depth of field front is 20.36. So you could actually measure that out if you want. And that's actually what I did to get that green line that I had going across there. And then the far limit's a little bit further, goes a little bit past. Now down here they have like this little diagram this is supposed to be a camera and then a person's face, and the center of the person's face is where your exact focal plane is. That's where it will be sharpest. And then what you have is what's an acceptable focused area, which is this line right here, and then acceptable and focused area with this line back here. So that is just like a little diagram so you can kind of see what's going on with these numbers here. Okay, so we can jump off of Aperture now. I think I've explained that well enough that you can understand what it does. So let's talk about ISO. We understand that ISO is basically like boosting the signal, making the sensor more sensitive to light. In the old days, they had film, and the film was a chemical process. So they would have chemicals that were more sensitive to light than other chemicals. But even back then, it had the same issue, whereas you would get more noise in the chemical reaction and not as clean of a picture if you used a high ISO film. So let's go ahead and just look at some of these pictures here so we can see what's going on. I'm going to unroll these layers, and you can see my top layer here is ISO 50, so that's as low as the camera will go. And if you zoom way in here, we're doing what we call pixel peeping. Uh, you don't really see any noise. It's a very, very clean image. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump a few steps, a few ISO steps past 50 and go right to 800. Now there's 100 and 200 and 3. You can change it to all these other ISOs before you get to 800. But for the sake of time, let's just jump right to the 800. And I'm going to zoom in. It still looks pretty clean. It's not too bad. But when you zoom in close enough and you stop, you can see that there's this noise in here. If I switch back, no noise, noise. So obviously this is less optimal because this muddies up the picture and can include details and stuff like that. Let's jump way far again and go right past 1600 and 3200 and go right to 6400. And now you can see how terrible that is. That's not good at all. So we have a lot of noise in there. However, you probably could get a photogrammetry result from this. It's just not going to be clean. It's not going to be as nice as the low ISO photogrammetry. And this I would not use. This is 51,200, and this is just not good at all. You're not going to want to use anything like this. So you'll stay away from these ISOs, and I would probably stay away from 6400 as well. 800, 1600, 3200 probably might be okay. 3200 is pushing it, but it was probably going to be okay. Now, I have not run any of these pictures through a noise reduction pass in any of my software, Photoshop or Lightroom or DxO, Photolab. All of these, you can run them through a noise reduction process that will get rid of some of the noise, but that can also get rid of some of the details too. And so it could be a little, if you don't have to run it through that, it's usually better. But there are times that I have done that. It's just that it's preferable not to have to run it through any kind of noise filtering if possible, or at least having the lowest ISO will do the least damage if you do run it through a noise filter. All right, so let's get on to the next subject.